In this video, we're going to show you how to replace the passenger side CV axle on your Nissan Rogue, located right behind the front passenger wheel. Let's go ahead and remove our center cap here, reach behind that and pull outward. Set that aside. Using a 21mm socket, let's go ahead, loosen and remove these lug nuts. Go ahead and grab that wheel. Remove it and set it aside. Using a pair of pliers, we want to go ahead and remove our cotter pin. Cotter pins are one-time use, so go ahead and discard that. Using a 32mm socket, loosen and remove the axle nut. I'm going to go ahead and see if that axle is free, and our axle is kind of stuck in the wheel hub. We're going to use a chisel in the middle here. Just going to work that back and forth. You want to make sure that that is free. Just going to work that a couple times back and forth. Make sure that that is loose enough by hand, and that is. On our lower ball joint, we want to go ahead and remove this nut and the bolt. This is a pinch bolt designed for this ball joint. So we want to go ahead and separate the lower control arm from the knuckle. Using our 18mm socket on the bolt side and an 18mm on the nut, let's go ahead and loosen. Now from the driver's side with the wheel on the vehicle, I'm going to go ahead and grab that wheel and I'm going to turn this. We started by putting the key in the on position, disengaging the steering wheel lock. That allows us to go ahead and move this freely. Now at this point, I want to go ahead and install a chisel into the back side here to open up this pinch bolt on the lower part of the knuckle. That should allow us to go ahead and separate our lower ball joint from the knuckle. Using a wedge type chisel, pop that in there. Now I want to go ahead and separate this here. We can see the ball joint separating from the knuckle. Go ahead and remove the chisel. Now in the middle of our CV axle here, there's a support unit here with a bearing in there. We're going to use a 13mm socket to remove the two bolts holding the lock collar in place. So we're going to use our socket with an extension. These bolts normally aren't super tight. So now that I have one loose, I'm going to reach right in there and unthread that. We'll get the lower one. Once you get those two bolts out, go ahead and set those aside. And there And remove our locking collar right here. Set that aside. Before separating the axle from the transmission, you want to put a drain bucket or catch can underneath the vehicle with some towels to catch any transmission fluid that should come out of the transmission. Now at this point, we're going to work on the outside. On the top right here, there is a flex hose retaining clip. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver or a small chisel type tool and just tap that clip off. That's going to allow us to loosen this hose and give us a little more flexibility. We now want to get the axle out of the knuckle. So working the axle inward. You can use that punch on the front side of that axle to try and push that through a little bit easier. Just going to release our ABS wire on the top here. That'll give us a little more flexibility. Now that we have the CV axle separated from the knuckle, let's go ahead and work on it and pull it out of the transmission. Using our slide hammer with our claw here, we're going to put it in behind the axle, but in front of the flange, and give this a few taps to pop this unit with the bearing out. Now we have our catch can underneath. We have some fluid coming out. Now that we have that bearing separated, remove the complete axle unit. Now you want to check this seal. Going to give it a quick little wipe here. I want to check that seal to see if it's torn or worn. The seal feels solid all the way around. There's no fragments or tears in the seal. Ours is in good shape, so we can go ahead and install our axle. Now, if your seal is damaged or worn, you want to go ahead and replace it at this time. Right here where our carrier bearing went, we can go ahead and clean this up as well. Get any debris out of there, that way we can make sure that our bearing sits in nice. And what I'm doing is I'm using some fine sandpaper to go ahead and clean up the surface here. We did have a little bit of a rust buildup or corrosion on the aluminum. So using some spray solvent, a little bit of sandpaper, we can go ahead and freshen this up again. It's going to make it smoother and easier for the new bearing to slide into place. Work our new axle in. Work that through the carrier. Slide this back. We want to engage the splines in the transmission here. Give that axle a wiggle back and forth, rotating it. Yeah. You can feel it locked up. We can also see that our bearing is lined up here. Our next step, we're going to line up our axle here, and we're going to use our dead blow hammer, and we're going to work this and tap the axle in. By doing this here, we're working that bearing into the carrier unit. You can hear and feel that it feels seated. You can inspect in the back side here. The bearing is fully seated inside the carrier, and the axle is seated into the transmission. You can see that the axle is fully seated into the transmission. We have a bunch of transmission fluid here. Use some solvent. Go ahead and clean this up. Let's go ahead and install our flange, line that up, get our 2 bolts started. I'm going to thread these bolts down as far as I can by hand. And then we'll go in with the ratchet. What we want to do is we want to snug that down. Once that bolt bottoms out, just give it a little bit more. You don't want to over tighten this because you're just going into aluminum there. All right, so the bolt has bottomed out. Not even a full quarter of a turn. Remove the axle nut if you have not already. Set that aside. Now I want to work our axle into our wheel hub. Work our ball joint into the knuckle. Install our lower bolt through the knuckle. Now, if the bolt doesn't want to go through, it just simply means that the ball joint notch itself is not lining up with the hole. Tap that on through. Let's go ahead and get that nut installed. Rotate that wheel just a little bit. Using our impact on the bolt side and our wrench on the front. Let's go ahead and snug this down. Torque the lower ball joint nut to 46 foot-pounds. Grab the flex hose, feed that up behind the strut clip or the mounting tab. You can take the spring clip here, push that up into place, tap that in, check that flex hose, make sure it's locked in nice. Grab your ABS wire, and we're simply going to lock this in place. And we'll try and install that axle nut. Install 2 lug nuts. And I'll rotate that down. We're going to use those 2 lug nuts here, use our pry bar. And we're going to torque this down to 92 foot-pounds. I'll line up our crown here. Install the cotter pin. Go ahead and bend that tab down. I'm just going to snip off the excess on the other side. Now that we've installed our cotter pin here, go ahead and remove the lug nuts. Once we have these off, we can then install the wheel. Take your wheel, line it up, get that set on, and let's go ahead and install all the lug nuts by hand. Get them started a few threads. Once we have all those started, let's go ahead and snug those down. Let's go ahead and torque down our lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. Once you're all torqued down, install your center cap. You're going to pay attention to the notch here on the cap. That's where your valve stem is going to go. Locate your transmission dipstick and fill tube underneath the hood. Now right on the side, there's a little retaining clip. You can normally just reach down and pry that out with your hand on the side, or use a small pocket screwdriver to prop the tab on it. Pull that up and out. I want to go ahead and check the fluid level. There is a hot location up here inside of 2 little arrows. So if the vehicle is up to operating temperature, the transmission fluid should be up here. Ours is low. I'm going to go ahead and wipe this. Set that dipstick aside. Use a clean, small funnel and add the appropriate fluid for the CVT transmission. In our case here, it's an S2 fluid. Now at this point here, the engine has been warmed up. We've cycled the shifter back and forth through the park and the other gears. want to go ahead and continue to add this fluid here. Just going to do one more check. I want to make sure we get an accurate reading, and we're still low. So we're going to continue to add fluid until we can get it up to that proper level. And at this point here, we're able to get our fluid filled up to the hot mark here. Go ahead and install that dipstick. Make sure that the tab itself here is going to line up with the locking tab here. Push that down and snap it into place.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.